What happens when two comedy legends clash over the very soul of humor itself? What we witnessed last night on The Late Show was nothing short of a complete meltdown that left audiences stunned and Dave Chappelle walking off the set in disgust. This is the story of how Stephen Colbert managed to destroy one of the most anticipated interviews of the year through his own arrogance and need to control the narrative. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below about what you think really went down, because what I'm about to tell you will change how you see late-night television forever. Dave Chappelle arrived at the Ed Sullivan Theater that evening expecting what every guest expects, a professional interview with one of television's most respected hosts. The comedian had been making his rounds promoting his latest special, and The Late Show was supposed to be the crown jewel of his media tour. What he didn't expect was to walk into what can only be described as an ambush orchestrated by a host, who seemed more interested in making headlines than conducting an actual interview. The tension was palpable from the moment Chappelle walked onto the stage. While the audience erupted in their usual enthusiastic applause, those paying close attention could see something was off in Colbert's demeanor. The host's usual warm smile seemed forced, and his body language suggested he was preparing for battle, rather than conversation. Chappelle, ever the professional, maintained his cool composure as he settled into the guest chair, but you could sense he was already reading the room and didn't like what he was seeing. Colbert opened with what seemed like standard pleasantries, asking about Chappelle's latest projects and his recent return to the comedy scene. But even these seemingly innocent questions carried an undertone that suggested the host had an agenda. When Chappelle began to discuss his creative process and the importance of artistic freedom in comedy, Colbert's responses became increasingly pointed, almost confrontational. It was as if he was trying to steer the conversation toward controversy rather than letting it flow naturally. The first real sign of trouble came when Colbert brought up the topic of cancel culture, a subject that has become a lightning rod in comedy circles. Instead of approaching it with the nuance and thoughtfulness that such a complex topic deserves, Colbert immediately took a confrontational stance, essentially challenging Chappelle's right to even discuss the subject. His tone shifted from interviewer to prosecutor, and you could see Chappelle's expression change as he realized this wasn't going to be the respectful conversation he had anticipated. What made this particularly uncomfortable was how Colbert seemed to be grandstanding for his audience rather than engaging with his guest. Every question felt loaded. Every response from the host felt like it was designed to put Chappelle on the defensive. The comedian, known for his quick wit and ability to handle difficult situations, tried to navigate the increasingly hostile environment with grace. But it was clear that Colbert had no intention of allowing him to control any part of the narrative. The audience, initially excited to see two comedy giants together, began to sense the tension as well. You could hear the energy in the room shift, from anticipation to discomfort, as Colbert continued to press Chappelle on topics that had nothing to do with why he was supposedly there. It became obvious that this wasn't an interview anymore, it was an interrogation. And Colbert was determined to be the one asking the questions while providing his own answers. As the segment progressed, Chappelle's patience was clearly being tested. Here was a man who had built his career on fearless comedy and authentic conversation, being treated like a criminal defendant by someone who was supposed to be his peer. The respect that should exist between two professionals in the same field was completely absent, replaced by what can only be described as Colbert's need to assert his moral superiority over his guest. The breaking point came when Colbert decided to lecture Chappelle about responsibility in comedy, as if the man who created Chappelle's show and revolutionized stand-up comedy needed lessons from a late-night host. Colbert's condescending tone reached a new level as he began to question not just Chappelle's recent material, but his entire approach to comedy. The host seemed to forget that he was talking to someone who had been pushing boundaries and challenging audiences long before. Late-night television became a platform for political activism. Chappelle, maintaining his composure but clearly frustrated, tried to explain his perspective on comedy as an art form that should be free from the constraints that Colbert seemed eager to impose. But the host wasn't interested in listening. He was interested in making points for his audience and his network. Every time Chappelle attempted to provide context or nuance to his position, Colbert would interrupt with what sounded like prepared talking points rather than genuine responses to what his guest was actually saying. The most telling moment came when Colbert accused Chappelle of using his platform irresponsibly, essentially suggesting that the comedian didn't understand the impact of his own work. This was the moment when you could see Chappelle's entire demeanor change. Here was a host, sitting in his comfortable late-night chair, lecturing one of the most thoughtful and socially conscious comedians of our time about responsibility and impact. The irony was lost on Colbert, but it certainly wasn't lost on Chappelle, or anyone watching who understood the history of both men's careers. What made this exchange particularly ugly was how Colbert seemed to be playing to his audience and his network's expectations rather than engaging in honest dialogue with his guest. Every question, every challenge, every interruption felt calculated to create a moment that would play well in clips and on social media. It was clear that Colbert had decided before the interview even began that he was going to position himself as the moral authority in the room, regardless of what his guest had to say. Chappelle, known for his ability to handle hostile crowds and difficult situations, found himself in the unprecedented position of being attacked by his own host. This wasn't a heckler in the audience or a difficult question from a journalist. This was a fellow comedian using his own show as a weapon against a guest who had come there in good faith. The betrayal of professional courtesy was stunning to witness, and you could see it registering on Chappelle's face as the interview continued to deteriorate. The host's questions became increasingly personal and accusatory, moving far beyond the scope of what any reasonable interview would cover. Colbert seemed determined to corner Chappelle into either defending positions he had never taken or apologizing for comedy that millions of people had found meaningful and important. It was a no-win situation, orchestrated by someone who seemed more interested in viral moments than genuine conversation. When Chappelle tried to redirect the conversation toward the actual craft of comedy and the challenges facing comedians in the current cultural climate, Colbert dismissed these concerns as if they were irrelevant. The host's lack of empathy for his guest's perspective was shocking, especially considering that both men work in the same industry and face many of the same challenges. But Colbert seemed more interested in distancing himself from Chappelle than finding common ground or understanding. The audience by this point was clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. What had been billed as a conversation between two comedy legends had devolved into what looked more like a public execution. Colbert's treatment of his guest was not just unprofessional, it was cruel, and everyone in the room could feel it. The energy that had been electric at the beginning of the show was now heavy with tension and embarrassment for what they were witnessing. The final straw came when Colbert made a comment that crossed every line of professional courtesy and human decency. Looking directly at Chappelle, the host suggested that the comedian's recent work had been harmful to communities that Chappelle himself had spent decades supporting and uplifting through his comedy and activism. This wasn't just a disagreement about comedy. This was a personal attack on Chappelle's character and legacy, delivered by someone who seemed to have forgotten that he was talking to a human being rather than a talking point. Chappelle's response was immediate and devastating. Standing up from his chair, the comedian looked directly at Colbert and said, "You know what, Stephen? I came here thinking we were going to have a conversation between two comedians who respect each other's work. Instead, you've spent the last 20 minutes trying to destroy me for your audience's entertainment. I don't know what happened to you, but this isn't comedy. This isn't journalism. This is just sad." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by a few scattered gasps from the audience. Colbert, perhaps realizing that he had pushed too far, tried to backtrack and salvage the interview, but the damage was done. Chappelle continued, "I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've never been treated with such disrespect by someone who claims to be in the same business. You're not interested in comedy, you're not interested in conversation, you're just interested in making yourself look good at my expense. That's not what I signed up for." The host's attempts to interrupt and regain control of the situation only made things worse. Colbert's voice took on a desperate edge as he tried to frame his behavior as legitimate journalism, but Chappelle wasn't having any of it. "Don't insult my intelligence by calling this journalism," the comedian shot back. "This is character. Assassination disguised as an interview, and I won't be part of it." What happened next will go down in late-night television history. Chappelle, with the dignity and composure that has defined his entire career, removed his microphone and placed it carefully on the desk. Looking out at the audience, he said, "I'm sorry you had to see this. You deserved better, and honestly, so did I." With that, he walked off the stage, leaving Colbert sitting alone at his desk with a studio full of stunned audience members. The host's attempts to continue the show after Chappelle's departure were painful to watch. Colbert tried to play off what had just happened as if it were part of some planned bit, but everyone in the room knew they had just witnessed something unprecedented. The man who had spent years building his reputation as a thoughtful interviewer had just destroyed his credibility in the span of a single interview. What made this entire situation even more tragic was how unnecessary it all was. Chappelle had come to the show ready to discuss his work, his perspectives on comedy, and his thoughts on the current state of the entertainment industry. Instead, he found himself subjected to what can only be described as a public humiliation attempt by someone who should have been his colleague and peer. The waste of an opportunity for genuine dialogue was heartbreaking for anyone who values authentic conversation in media. The aftermath in the studio was uncomfortable to witness. Audience members sat in stunned silence, many of them clearly processing what they had just seen. Some were visibly upset, others seemed angry, and a few were already getting up to leave. The energy that had filled the room at the beginning of the show was completely gone, replaced by an atmosphere of confusion and disappointment. Colbert's closing remarks were rambling and defensive, a stark contrast to his usual polished delivery. It was clear that even he knew he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The host, who had built his career on interviewing guests with respect and intelligence, had just demonstrated the exact opposite of those qualities. And everyone watching knew it. The credits rolled over a studio that felt more like a funeral than a comedy show. What should have been a celebration of two great comedic minds had instead become a cautionary tale about what happens when ego and agenda override professionalism and respect. Dave Chappelle walked out of that studio with his dignity intact, while Stephen Colbert was left to face the consequences of a moment that will define his career in ways he probably never intended. So what do you think really happened here? Was Colbert trying to make a point, or did he just let his personal feelings override his professional judgment? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and make sure you subscribe for more stories that reveal what really goes on behind the cameras in Hollywood. Because if this taught us anything, it's that sometimes the most revealing moments happen when people think no one is really paying attention.